The ocean stretched endlessly, a black sheet under a sky bruised with storm clouds, and the destroyer ship USS Halcyon carved its way through waters that seemed colder than death. The mission had been marked as classified from the very beginning, sealed in red files and whispered only in steel rooms far beneath naval command. No one on board fully understood why they had been ordered into this uncharted stretch of the North Atlantic, but orders were orders. And so the team of 12 Navy operatives, armed with state-of-the-art gear, night vision goggles, rifles primed with fresh magazines, and an unspoken trust in each other, stepped into the belly of their mission without question. Among them was Lieutenant Sarah Jennings, the only woman in the squad but never the weakest link, her resolve sharper than any blade they carried. The air that night was unnaturally heavy, pressing against lungs like a weight that refused to lift, and even the most seasoned among them felt an unease they couldn't name. Their commanding officer, Captain Rhodes, stood on deck with binoculars pressed tight against his weathered face, searching ahead as though his instincts screamed at him to turn back. Yet he gave the order anyway: deployment in 10 minutes. The small tactical boats would be lowered, the team would push into the fog-shrouded island ahead, and whatever lay hidden in the mist would be brought to light. The fog rolled in thicker than any natural mist they had ever seen. It wasn't a drifting haze but a wall, a solid sheet of gray that seemed to crawl across the ocean as though alive. By the time the first boat touched water, the destroyer itself looked like a phantom, swallowed up by shifting veils. The Navy team sat low in their boats, motors muted to avoid noise detection, weapons clutched close. Sarah sat near the bow, scanning the fog with eyes that missed nothing. The water was eerily still, no waves slapped against the hull, no gulls cried above, not even the wind dared disturb this suffocating silence. The fog dampened sound, turning the world into a suffocating bubble where even a whisper felt like a scream. One of the men, Ramirez, muttered a prayer under his breath, and another, Carter, elbowed him sharply to shut up. But fear doesn't obey orders, and Sarah could see it in their eyes. The fog was already inside their heads. She tightened her grip on the rifle and forced herself to breathe steady, because if she cracked, they all would. The boats touched the rocky edge of the island, their rubber bottoms scraping against stone, and the squad disembarked in practiced silence, boots pressing against wet earth. Ahead lay only twisted silhouettes of trees and cliffs, shrouded in a haze so thick it was impossible to tell where the land ended or the sky began. The team advanced in a diamond formation, sensors scanning, night vision goggles useless against the density of the fog. It was as though the air itself resisted being pierced, blurring outlines, distorting depth, until even shapes a few feet away looked like shadows stretched by nightmares. Sarah moved with precision, her nerves wired sharp, each step a controlled act of discipline. Yet even she felt something watching, something pressing from the fog, an intelligence that could not be explained by weather patterns or atmospheric anomalies. It was alive and it was patient. They reached what looked like ruins at the center of the island, crumbling stone walls, blackened as if burned centuries ago, half buried under moss and ash. The ground was littered with strange symbols carved into stone, curling patterns that twisted like serpents frozen mid-strike. Captain Rhodes gave the silent signal to spread out and investigate, and the team obeyed, though their movements were tense and quick. Sarah crouched beside one of the symbols, brushing her glove against the stone, but the moment she touched it, the fog around her seemed to shift. A low hum vibrated through the ground, rising in her bones, a frequency that had no sound but resonated in her skull. She pulled back instantly, her instincts screaming, but before she could warn the others, the first scream split the air. It was Ramirez, vanishing into the mist as though hands had yanked him backward. His rifle clattered against stone, spinning uselessly as his voice was swallowed by the fog. The squad spun, rifles raised, but there was nothing to shoot, only the sound of a man's panic fading into silence. Rhodes barked orders, his voice steady, but it did little to ease the sudden spike of terror clawing through the men. 2 more shadows flickered and were gone, taken as though the fog itself had reached out and plucked them from reality. Sarah's pulse pounded, her breath sharp, but she forced herself to think, to act, to survive. She shouted for the squad to regroup, to form a defensive circle, but the fog disobeyed logic. It warped direction, muffled voices, twisted distances. Men stumbled in the haze, firing blindly at movements that weren't there, and bullets cracked into ruins with empty fury. In the chaos, Sarah realized the truth: this wasn't weather. It was a predator. Sarah's throat felt raw as she shouted again for the team to regroup, but her own words came back to her distorted, as if the fog were a mirror twisting sound into fragments. Figures moved in the haze, but she couldn't tell if they were her men or something else, and she didn't dare fire for fear of hitting one of her own. She heard Captain Rhodes cursing, trying to rally the squad, his voice slipping further away even though he had been only 10 feet from her a moment ago. The ruins seemed to stretch and fold, ancient stone walls flickering in and out of sight as if the island itself shifted when hidden by the fog. Her boots pressed against the wet earth, and she moved quickly, heart hammering, rifle lifted in a tight grip. Then to her left, a burst of automatic fire lit up the haze, muzzle flashes glowing like fireflies. Screams followed, guttural and short, cut off with a finality that churned Sarah's stomach. She sprinted toward the sound, but by the time she reached it, all she found was an abandoned rifle on the ground and dark streaks leading into the mist. Her training screamed at her to keep control, to focus on survival, but a chill deeper than fear slid down her spine. Something was hunting them. She forced herself to remember every ounce of her training. Control your breath. Control your weapon. Control your mind. But the fog was breaking those rules. Her body felt sluggish, her ears rang with phantom whispers that didn't belong to her squad, voices calling her name in tones both familiar and strange. She ignored them, scanning for movement, when suddenly a figure stumbled into her from the side. It was Carter, face pale, eyes wide, chest heaving with panic. His helmet was gone and blood smeared across his cheek, though she couldn't tell if it was his own. "They're gone, Jennings, they're all gone," he gasped, clutching her arm like a drowning man. She gritted her teeth, shaking him hard. "No one's gone unless we stop fighting. Get your head straight," she snapped, forcing his eyes to lock with hers. That moment of human connection steadied him, but only slightly. He swallowed, lifted his rifle again and nodded. Together they moved, keeping back to back, covering angles, trying to find any trace of the squad. The ruins grew stranger as they pressed deeper. The stones were carved with spirals and jagged runes, half covered in moss but pulsing faintly as though light lived inside them. Carter muttered under his breath that this place was wrong, cursed, a place no man was meant to tread. Sarah ignored his words but couldn't shake the same thought growing in her chest. The fog wasn't natural and it wasn't alone, it had purpose. She spotted another shadow ahead and both raised their rifles, but before they could fire, Rhodes stumbled into view, bleeding from his shoulder, weapon half raised. Relief shot through Sarah, and she pulled him toward cover behind a collapsed wall. He looked shaken but alive, growling that half the team had been taken, the others scattered. His jaw tightened with rage, not fear, and he barked at them to hold ground. But before he could finish his order, the fog shifted again, rolling with a force like a tidal wave. Shapes emerged in it, elongated, twisted forms that looked almost human but wrong, their limbs bending in ways bones shouldn't allow, their eyes glowing faintly with a pale light. Carter swore under his breath, Rhodes raised his weapon, and Sarah's instinct screamed to shoot. They opened fire, bullets cracking through the haze, hitting bodies that staggered but did not fall. The creatures moved unnaturally fast, darting between the fog like phantoms, impossible to track. One leapt from the mist, crashing into Carter, knocking him to the ground with a screech that split the air like metal tearing. Sarah reacted instantly, slamming her rifle but into the creature's head, yanking Carter free, and unloading 3 rounds point blank into its chest. It shrieked and dissolved into smoke as if never solid at all, but the fog thickened around them, reacting with a hunger she could feel in her teeth. Rhodes roared for them to retreat, to fall back to the landing zone, but the way back was gone. The fog had swallowed it. They moved anyway, sticking close, every step a battle to stay alive. The sounds of pursuit followed them, hissing, whispering, claws scraping stone. Carter kept stumbling, panic close to breaking him again, but Sarah shoved him forward, refusing to let him fall. Her lungs burned, the air too heavy, and she realized the fog wasn't just confusion. It was suffocating them slowly, leaching the oxygen from their bodies. Rhodes collapsed against a wall, clutching his wound, insisting he could go no further. Sarah crouched beside him, blood slick against her gloves, and he grabbed her wrist hard. "You're stronger than the rest, Jennings. Don't let this thing take you too," he growled, his eyes fierce even in pain. She wanted to argue, but before she could, claws tore from the fog and yanked him back. She fired desperately, bullets sparking off stone, but he was gone, his shout cut short. Carter screamed, lifting his weapon to fire, but Sarah yanked him away, forcing him to run. Her chest ached, grief and fury boiling, but survival demanded movement, demanded focus. The ruins opened into a clearing at the island's heart, a black pit yawning in the ground. The fog rose from it like smoke from a wound, pulsing with each heartbeat of the island itself. Sarah froze, realizing they had reached the source. The pit was lined with the same runes, glowing faintly, and inside something shifted, something vast, awake and aware. Carter backed away, shaking his head violently, muttering that they had to get out, that no mission was worth this. But Sarah knew there was no way out, not unless they stopped it here. The fog was alive, and this pit was its heart. She felt a strange clarity then, an iron weight settling into her bones. She raised her rifle, tightened her grip, and stepped toward the pit as Carter's pleas echoed uselessly. She wasn't going to run. Not now. The pit breathed like a living thing, every swell of fog rising from its depths carrying with it the stench of rot and salt, like a graveyard long forgotten beneath the sea. Sarah kept her rifle aimed, though some part of her new bullets alone could never kill what slept below. Carter's voice shook as he begged her not to move closer, but she ignored him, her focus narrowed to the runes glowing faintly around the rim. They weren't just markings, they were restraints, old seals burned into stone to hold something prisoner. She realized with dawning horror that whatever the fog was, it wasn't wild. It was controlled once, contained, and now those seals were failing. Her boots pressed against damp earth, her eyes locked on the pulsating light in the pit, when a sound like 1,000 whispers rose from below, words she couldn't understand but felt deep in her chest. The fog surged, curling like fingers across the ground, wrapping around Carter's legs. He screamed, firing wildly, but his shots vanished into the haze with no sound, no impact. Sarah lunged, grabbing his vest, dragging him with strength she didn't know she had, her muscles burning, refusing to let him slip away. The fog fought back, clawing at him, pulling, stretching his body toward the pit, but she screamed in defiance and ripped him free, shoving him against the ruins. His eyes were wide with terror, his breath shallow, but he was alive, for now. Her own body trembled, lungs straining for air in the choking mist. She ripped off her mask, it was useless now, and pressed her forehead to the cold stone wall, trying to think, to find a plan. Navy training drilled a single truth into her: adapt or die. This wasn't a mission anymore. This was survival against something no one had warned them about, something older than their country, older than their oceans. She thought of Rhodes's last words, the command in his voice telling her not to let this thing take her too. She felt fury ignite beneath her fear, sharp and hot. She wasn't going to be consumed like the others. She would fight even if she had to do it alone. She turned to Carter, who was shaking so hard his weapon rattled in his hands. His mind was fracturing and she knew it. "Listen to me," she snapped, grabbing his face and forcing his eyes to meet hers. "You hold yourself together or you're dead. Understand?" He swallowed, nodded weakly, but the hollowness in his gaze told her she couldn't rely on him for long. They needed firepower, something more than rifles. Sarah scanned the ruins until her eyes caught a supply crate half buried in the rubble. One Rhodes must have ordered dropped before the fog hit. She sprinted for it, Carter stumbling after her, her boots crunching over wet stone. The crate was sealed tight, but she smashed the lock with the butt of her rifle and pried it open. Inside were explosives, satchel charges, grenades, enough to make a dent in whatever lay beneath the pit. Her hands shook as she lifted the charges, but her mind was steel. This was it. If they could collapse the pit, maybe they could seal the source, trap the fog back where it came from. Carter's face paled further when he realized her plan. "You're insane," he whispered. "You'll bury us with it." She stared at him, her jaw hard. Better buried than consumed. He didn't argue. Fear had broken him too far for defiance. The fog thickened, pressing close, shapes moving within it, the half-formed figures they'd fought earlier. But now there were more of them, dozens at least, silhouettes circling, whispering in voices that bled into Sarah's skull. She ignored them, strapping the charges to her vest, pulling the pins on grenades and clipping them to her belt. Every motion was precise, practiced, her hands steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. Carter tried to speak, to plead, but she cut him off sharply. "Stay behind me. Fire at anything that moves. If I fall, you run." The words came out like steel, though she didn't believe for a second he could run fast enough. Still, it was something to keep him focused, to keep him alive a little longer. They advanced toward the pit again, fog creatures shifting and sliding closer. Sarah opened fire in controlled bursts, each shot clearing a brief hole in the mist, bodies dissolving only to reform further away. It was like fighting smoke, but she pressed forward anyway, her teeth gritted, her resolve harder than ever. A claw slashed out, catching her arm, tearing her sleeve, blood running hot down her skin. She didn't falter, driving her boot into the thing's chest, blasting it back into nothing. Carter fired blindly at shadows, screaming more than aiming, but his bullets bought them seconds. Seconds were enough. She reached the edge of the pit, staring into the abyss where the fog poured out like breath from a corpse. The whispers grew louder, pressing against her skull, filling her with visions she didn't want to see. Her family's faces, her teammates' screams, Rhodes's hand reaching for her from the depths. She forced herself to ignore it, to focus only on the task. She pulled the first satchel charge from her vest, slamming it into the cracks of the rune-carved stones, setting timers with movements so fast they blurred. 1, 2, 3 charges, each placed carefully around the rim. Carter sobbed, begging her to stop, but she moved with the certainty of someone who knew there was no other choice. When the final charge was armed, she turned back to Carter, her face set with grim determination. "We finished this," she said simply. His lips trembled, but he nodded, clutching his rifle tighter. The fog surged violently now, aware of the threat, crashing against them like a wave of claws and teeth. Sarah roared, firing her rifle until the magazine clicked empty, then yanking grenades free and hurling them into the mist. Explosions thundered, fire cutting brief holes in the gray, illuminating monstrous shapes writhing within. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. She was the last line now, and she would not break. She grabbed Carter by the collar, dragged him back from the edge, and with one final look at the pit, whispered under her breath, not a prayer but a promise. "You won't take us." Then she slammed her hand onto the detonator. The world erupted in fire. The charges tore through the ruins with a roar that shook the ground beneath their boots, flames ripping upward as though the island itself had been split open. The shockwave hurled Sarah and Carter backward, crashing them into the jagged remains of a wall, air ripped from their lungs. For a heartbeat the fog recoiled, drawn back like a curtain, and for the first time since they had stepped onto the island, Sarah could see sky, black, storm-torn but real. She gasped, blood filling her mouth, her ribs aching with every breath, but hope surged like adrenaline through her veins. The pit shuddered, stones collapsing inward, the runes cracking and sparking with dying light. Carter coughed violently beside her, half-conscious but alive. For a flicker of a moment she thought they had won. But the fog wasn't done. It screamed. Not with sound, but with a vibration that pulsed through bone and muscle, rattling their skulls until Carter clutched his head and shrieked. From the pit surged not mist but shapes, hundreds of them, spilling upward like smoke given form, half human, half shadow, their glowing eyes all fixed on her. The pit had been wounded, but not destroyed. Whatever lived within had survived centuries of restraint. It wouldn't die so easily. Sarah dragged herself up, body bruised and shaking, rifle long since emptied. She pulled her sidearm, every breath ragged, every heartbeat pounding with rage and fear in equal measure. The creatures swarmed closer, whispering in voices that carried her mother's tone, her comrades' screams, even Rhodes's growl of command. It tried to break her from the inside, but she clenched her jaw so tight her teeth ached. "You don't get to have me," she hissed, raising her pistol and firing point blank into the nearest shade. The bullet tore through, scattering it like smoke, but more pressed in, endless. Carter stumbled, firing his rifle until the barrel smoked, his sobs louder than the gunfire. He wasn't going to last. Sarah shoved him back toward the ruins, shouting at him to keep moving, to stay alive, though she doubted he even heard her. She backed into the clearing, every step a battle, her pistol clattering empty after only a handful of rounds. The creatures circled, pressing closer, the fog thickening again. She reached for her belt, finding the last grenade clipped to her vest. She yanked the pin with her teeth, hurled it into the densest part of the swarm, and dove to the ground as the blast ripped through the air. Fire tore shadows apart, the shockwave scattering the haze, but it was like fighting the tide with bare hands. The ruins groaned, stones collapsing further into the pit, sparks of dying runes flashing like lightning. Sarah realized the island itself was collapsing, the ground shuddering as cracks split outward from the heart. Water surged in from underground, hissing steam rising as seawater met the fiery wreckage below. The ocean was trying to swallow the island whole. She pushed herself up, dragging Carter by the vest again, forcing his legs to move. His eyes were wild, unfocused, but survival instinct clung to him like a thread. Together they stumbled through the ruins as walls toppled, stones crashing like thunder, the fog swirling tighter, refusing to let them go. The way back to the shoreline was a blur, the landscape shifting under the weight of collapse. What had once been a twisted maze of walls was now falling rubble, jagged edges and fire lighting the mist in unnatural colors. Carter tripped, falling to his knees, sobbing that he couldn't go on. Sarah dropped beside him, shaking him violently. "You're a sailor of the United States Navy," she snarled, her voice steel even as her throat burned. "You don't get to quit. Not now." Something in her fury snapped him back, at least enough for him to stagger to his feet. She wrapped his arm around her shoulders, half carrying him forward, boots pounding through mud and ash. Behind them the pit roared, fog billowing outward like a tidal wave, shapes clawing at the ground, tearing stone apart as if the island itself was their prison breaking free. The ocean roared louder, waves crashing against cliffs, and Sarah knew they had only minutes before the whole place sank. They burst through the last line of ruins, reaching the treeline where their boats had landed. Or should have. The shore was gone, swallowed by rising water and waves that smashed against the rocks. The boats were nowhere to be seen, likely consumed already. Carter's body sagged with despair, his weight nearly pulling her down, but Sarah refused to stop. Her eyes swept the coastline, searching, scanning, until she spotted it. A single boat, half broken but still afloat, tangled in rocks a few hundred feet downshore. She dragged Carter with renewed strength, every muscle screaming, the fog chasing at their backs like a living tide. Shadows swarmed ahead, blocking the path, their whispering voices so loud now they drowned even the crash of the sea. Sarah pulled Carter behind her, yanking her knife free from her vest. No bullets, no grenades, just steel. The blade gleamed faintly in the firelight as she raised it in a defiant grip. The first shadow lunged, claws slashing. Sarah ducked low, slashing upward, her blade cutting through smoke and sparks of light. Another came and another, each strike a battle of instinct and rage. She fought like a wild animal, teeth bared, blood streaking her face, every motion fueled by survival and fury. The fog pressed tighter, suffocating, choking, but she carved a path with sheer willpower. Carter stumbled behind her, barely able to keep up, but her determination was enough to drag them both forward. The boat was closer now, rocking against the rocks, freedom just within reach. But the pit screamed one last time, the fog surging in a wave so massive it blotted out the sky. Sarah braced herself, knife raised, body trembling but unbroken. If this was where she fell, she would fall fighting. The wave of fog hit like a tidal surge, swallowing the ruins, the trees, the very coastline in a single choking sweep. Sarah braced herself, pressing Carter hard against the rocks, shielding him with her own body as the haze rushed past them like liquid shadow. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, only the crushing weight of the mist pressing into her lungs, searing her throat like poison. She forced air into her chest, teeth clenched, every ounce of her willpower fighting back the suffocating pressure. When the surge passed, she stumbled forward, dragging Carter by the collar, her vision blurred but her focus locked on the broken boat rocking against the rocks ahead. The creatures followed, their glowing eyes scattered through the haze, crawling along the cliffs, their claws leaving jagged marks in the stone as though the island itself bled under their pursuit. Her boots slipped on wet rock, the waves crashing higher now, swallowing more of the land every second. Carter collapsed again, coughing, muttering that it was hopeless, that they'd never make it. Rage flared in Sarah's chest at his words, and she grabbed him by the vest, forcing him upright. "You don't get to give up, sailor." "Not while I'm still breathing," she snarled, her voice echoing in the fog. For a flicker of a moment, she saw something spark in his eyes, shame, perhaps, or the faintest glimmer of courage, but it was enough. He staggered forward, leaning on her, and together they pushed through the last stretch of broken ground. The boat was closer now, but the fog fought harder. Shadows poured across the rocks like a tide, dozens of them forming out of the mist, their voices louder, clearer. They didn't just whisper anymore, they screamed. The sound drilled into Sarah's head, filling it with visions she couldn't shut out. She saw Ramirez's face twisted in agony, Rhodes's bloody hand reaching for her, her family standing at the shoreline with blank eyes and open mouths. She shook her head violently, biting her tongue until blood filled her mouth, grounding herself in pain. "You are not real," she spat, raising her knife again. The closest creature lunged and she slashed through it with all her strength, forcing Carter to keep moving behind her. They carved their way forward inch by inch, blood and sweat dripping, the broken boat their only salvation. By the time they reached it, Sarah's arms trembled, her knife slick with black ichor that evaporated into smoke as quickly as it appeared. The boat was in worse shape than she'd hoped, its hull cracked, one or missing, its motor hanging loosely like a broken limb. But it floated, and that was all that mattered. She shoved Carter into it, ignoring his protests, then climbed in after him, her chest heaving, her body burning with exhaustion. The water surged violently beneath them, waves smashing against the rocks, but she managed to push the boat free with one final desperate shove. It slid into the open sea, rocking dangerously but afloat. For the first time, Sarah felt a gasp of relief break through the haze of terror. They were off the island. The relief didn't last. The fog followed. It rolled over the water, not slowed by the waves, not weakened by the sea's salt or wind. It spread in every direction, chasing them, crawling across the surface like a living storm. Carter tried the motor, his shaking hands fumbling at the cords, but the machine was dead, useless. Panic clawed at him, but Sarah snatched the remaining oar, jamming it into the water, rowing with everything left in her. Each stroke sent pain screaming through her shoulders, but she refused to stop. The fog was gaining, shadows darting within it, their glowing eyes cutting through the gray. She rowed harder, teeth clenched, refusing to let despair drown her. Carter looked back, his face pale, lips trembling. "It's coming," he whispered, voice broken. Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't waste breath on fear. She rowed and rowed until her arms felt like they would tear from her body, until the boat creaked and groaned against the waves. The fog grew closer, tendrils curling across the water, licking at the edges of the boat like hungry tongues. Sarah dropped the oar, snatched her knife again and stood at the bow. Her chest heaved, her vision blurred, but her stance was unbroken, knife raised against the storm. She was a silhouette against the sea, a lone figure refusing to bow. The first shadow hit the boat, clawing at the edges, rocking it violently. Carter screamed, kicking at it, firing his last bullets into the mist. The creature dissolved, but two more took its place, crawling aboard, their forms solidifying with each second. Sarah lunged, slashing with fury, her blade cutting one through the throat, its body evaporating into mist that wrapped around her arms. She didn't stop. She drove the knife into the second creature's chest, kicking it back into the sea, her roar tearing from her lungs with primal rage. The boat rocked dangerously, water spilling in, but she planted her feet wide, steadying it with sheer strength. The fog shrieked again, louder than before, the sound carrying across the waves, shaking the boat until Carter covered his ears and screamed in agony. Sarah didn't falter. She raised her knife high, eyes blazing, every nerve in her body alight with fury. She screamed back at it, a raw, defiant sound that cut through the roar of the ocean. The fog pressed closer, swirling, trying to drown them both in its endless gray. But she stood unbroken, a lone figure with a blade, refusing to be swallowed. If the sea had to take her, it would take her fighting. The night deepened, and the fog thickened until it seemed as though the world itself had shrunk to the size of a single breath. The Navy team moved in tense silence, guided only by their instincts and by the flickering beam of Maya's flashlight, which she kept low to avoid drawing too much attention. The forest pressed in on them, branches clawing at their uniforms, the damp earth sucking at their boots. Each step felt like it carried the weight of the unknown, as though some unseen presence lingered just beyond the veil of mist, waiting for them to falter. They spoke little now, for words seemed swallowed by the fog, dissipating before they could truly form. Only the occasional whisper, short commands or warnings, broke the stillness. Maya felt the tension coil tighter with each passing moment, the silence punctuated only by the pounding of her own heartbeat. The memory of the earlier attack still haunted her, the way the shapes had come out of nowhere, dragging men into the mist, their screams cut short as though silenced by the fog itself. She kept her finger tight against the trigger, her senses sharpened to a painful edge, ready to act at the faintest sign of movement. They reached the remains of an abandoned outpost, its skeletal structures barely visible through the haze. The place looked like it had been swallowed by time. Rusted metal frames stood crooked, wires dangled like lifeless vines, and scraps of canvas flapped faintly in the wet wind. The team paused, taking cover among the ruins, their eyes sweeping every corner. It felt like a trap, a place designed for ambush, and Maya could see the same thought mirrored in the tight expressions of her comrades. The silence was broken by a faint metallic scrape, something moving across the broken ground nearby. Maya raised her hand for quiet, and the team froze, every weapon aimed into the shifting fog. For a moment, there was nothing, only the sound of their own shallow breathing. Then, without warning, a figure burst through the haze, colliding with one of the soldiers and sending both of them crashing to the ground. Chaos erupted instantly, gunfire flashing like lightning in the mist, shadows leaping and vanishing in the flashes of light. The fog distorted everything, turning friend and foe into shifting silhouettes. Maya fired, each shot aimed with instinct rather than sight, the recoil vibrating up her arms. She heard the grunt of a creature collapsing, but another form rushed past her vision, fast and silent as the fog itself. The battle became a blur, a storm of confusion and terror. Soldiers shouted, their voices cracking with panic, while the creatures attacked with feral precision. They seemed to melt into the mist, appearing only long enough to strike before disappearing again. Maya fought to keep her focus, her training forcing her to block out the fear clawing at her mind. She saw one of her team dragged screaming into the shadows, his cries cut off so suddenly it was as if he had been erased from existence. Rage flared in her chest, pushing back against the terror, and she fired again, chasing the faint glimmers of movement that teased her vision. But no matter how many fell, more emerged as though the fog itself was birthing them endlessly. Her comrades were faltering, ammunition dwindling, their formation breaking apart as the mist drove wedges between them. It was then that Maya realized they were being hunted not randomly but with strategy. The creatures weren't mindless, they were herding the team, separating them, isolating each member until they stood alone in the fog, easy prey. And if that was their strategy, then Maya knew she had only one choice. She would have to stand against them in a way they didn't expect. She shouted orders, her voice sharp, cutting through the chaos like a blade. She called her team to regroup, forcing them back toward the remnants of the outpost, where the ruins offered at least some protection. Her words steadied them, pulling them from the brink of panic, reminding them that they were not just survivors, they were Navy soldiers trained for war. They formed a tight circle among the broken walls, weapons aimed outward, covering every angle. The fog pressed close, alive with the shifting of unseen bodies, but for the first time in what felt like hours, the team stood together, unbroken. Maya felt the weight of responsibility press harder than ever before. She knew if they faltered again they would all be lost. Her grip on her rifle tightened until her knuckles turned white, and she whispered to herself, a promise and a warning both, "Not while I still stand." The fog answered with silence, but in that silence was the certainty of the next attack, and Maya prepared herself, every nerve on fire, every muscle coiled. When it came, she would be ready no matter the cost. Karen had always believed she held unshakable power. For months, her authority had gone unchecked, her voice the loudest in every meeting, her rules the chains binding every household in the neighborhood. She thrived on intimidation, weaponizing the HOA guidelines like blades against anyone who dared to resist her. But what she didn't anticipate was that her latest battle, the one against my family, would bring her to the breaking point of her influence, unraveling the empire she had worked so hard to build. The day of the reckoning began with whispers. Neighbors had begun to talk, quietly at first behind closed doors, then openly in the streets. The story of what Karen had done to my father, the pepper spray incident, had spread further than she ever imagined. At first, she tried to control the narrative, claiming my father had been violent, that she had acted in self-defense. But her words fell apart under the weight of undeniable truth. The security footage from our porch, clear as crystal, showed her aggression, her cruelty, and my father's composed restraint. That footage had become the spark that ignited the neighborhood against her. By the time the HOA scheduled its emergency meeting, the room was already charged with tension. My family sat together at one side of the long wooden table, while Karen sat at the head, flanked by her closest allies. She wore her signature smugness like a crown, but even from across the room, I could see the cracks forming in her facade. The air was heavy, silent except for the shuffling of papers and the occasional cough, until my father stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he spoke, the authority of decades in military command resonated in every syllable. He addressed not just Karen but everyone present. "You entrusted this board with the responsibility of fairness, respect, and order," he began. "But under Mrs. Karen's leadership, these responsibilities have been twisted into tools of personal power. Rules were bent not for the community's benefit, but for her own satisfaction. You've seen it. Many of you have felt it." The silence in the room deepened as he continued, his calm demeanor like steel under pressure. "She assaulted me unprovoked. That alone is reason enough for her removal. But what should trouble you more is the pattern. Harassment, intimidation, abuse of authority. This is not leadership, it's tyranny." Karen, red-faced and trembling with barely contained fury, slammed her hand on the table. "You don't get to call me a tyrant in front of my board. You're twisting everything. I did what I had to do to protect this community from people like you." The words echoed sharply, but they had the opposite effect she wanted. Instead of rallying support, her outburst peeled back the thin veneer of control she still clung to. I saw it in the eyes of the neighbors around us, eyes that no longer carried the fear of her, but the realization that they didn't have to put up with her anymore. One neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, stood hesitantly. Her voice quivered at first, but it grew stronger as she spoke. "Karen fined me for having my daughter's bicycle on the porch. She humiliated me in front of the whole street. I stayed quiet because I didn't want trouble, but she's right. This isn't leadership. Another neighbor followed, then another. Stories tumbled out, of unjust fines, of threats, of humiliation. Each testimony was a nail in the coffin of Karen's reign. The walls she had built around her authority crumbled in real time, brick by brick, under the weight of collective courage. I watched Karen's face as the tide turned completely. Her eyes darted wildly, her mouth opened and closed as if searching for words that no longer held power. For the first time she looked small, stripped of her arrogance, cornered not by my father's strength alone, but by the voices of those she had oppressed. When the motion was finally called to vote on her removal, it wasn't even close. Hand after hand rose in the air, firm and unshaken. My father didn't raise his hand, he simply watched, his role already complete. When the final count was read aloud, Karen's fate was sealed. She was out. The silence that followed was different from the tension before. This was a silence of release, of freedom reclaimed. Karen, pale and trembling, tried to protest, but her words were drowned out by the collective murmur of the neighbors rising to leave. She had no throne left to sit on, no crown to wear. The queen of the HOA had been dethroned by her own kingdom. Outside the air felt fresher, freer. Neighbors who had once walked with hunched shoulders now spoke to each other with relief, even laughter. My father remained stoic, but there was a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. He hadn't sought revenge, only justice. And in the end, justice had prevailed not because of violence or anger, but because truth had spoken louder than fear. Karen's downfall was not just her own undoing, it was the community's rebirth. For the first time in years, the neighborhood wasn't under her shadow. Instead, it stood in the light of possibility, free to rebuild trust, free to breathe. And as I looked around at the faces of those who had once been silent, I realized something powerful. Even the loudest tyrant cannot withstand the united voices of those she once silenced. Life has a strange way of unfolding, and often the things we least expect become the lessons we most needed. After all the subtle signs, the soft hints, and the little phrases that had slipped from her lips over weeks, I finally understood that what she had been saying all along wasn't just about words. It was about feelings too deep to be contained, emotions that were finding their way into the open no matter how carefully she tried to hide them. When a woman truly wants you, she doesn't always confess it directly. Instead, her heart speaks in small gestures, in the way she looks at you when she thinks you're not paying attention, and in the words she lets slip when her guard is down. By the time I reached this realization, the evidence had become overwhelming, like puzzle pieces that could no longer be ignored. She had told me more than once, "I feel safe with you." That phrase seemed so simple on the surface, but in truth, it carried weight. Safety isn't about walls or locked doors. It's about trust, comfort, and a sense of belonging. The more I reflected on it, the more I understood that safety is one of the rarest gifts a woman can feel with a man. When she said it, she wasn't just describing a moment. She was revealing that my presence made her feel grounded, protected, and free from the chaos of the world. That was not an accident, it was the language of her heart whispering what her lips could not say outright. Then there were the moments when she would laugh lightly and say, "You always know what I'm thinking." At first, I brushed it off as playful teasing, but later I realized what it meant. To her, it wasn't about me being psychic. It was about a deep connection forming between us, one where silences were no longer empty but filled with understanding. When she looked into my eyes and smiled after saying it, it wasn't just a compliment. It was an admission that she felt seen, understood, and mirrored in ways no one else had managed. That unspoken bond was her heart's way of saying, "I trust you enough to let you read me without words." Sometimes she would sigh softly and murmur, "I wish you were here." Those words carried longing, an ache that stretched across space and time. Whether we were apart for hours or days, her voice when she said it carried a quiet yearning that revealed far more than she intended. A woman who wishes for your presence even when you are gone is a woman who has already let you into the core of her life. Her heart was no longer just speaking, it was reaching out, pulling me closer even from a distance. That wish was more than a phrase, it was a confession dressed in subtlety. Other times she would say, "You always make me smile." That phrase too was more than flattery. Anyone can make someone laugh in a moment, but making someone smile, genuinely, effortlessly, is something different. It meant that my presence brightened her world, that being with me lifted the weight from her shoulders. The smile she spoke of wasn't the polite one people wear in crowded rooms. It was the real one, the one that blooms only when a person feels joy. And every time she said it, I realized she was unconsciously revealing how much happiness she associated with me. One of the most powerful moments came when she admitted, "I don't talk like this with anyone else." That phrase sealed everything. It told me that I had entered a space within her heart that was not accessible to others. She had walls around her, built carefully through years of protecting herself, and yet, with me, those walls lowered. The things she shared, the secrets she trusted me with, the softness she revealed, it all meant she was letting me into the most sacred parts of her being. When a woman says that, she is not just highlighting a difference in conversation. She is handing you proof of her vulnerability, proof that you are already occupying a place in her life that no one else has reached. Perhaps the phrase that stayed with me most was when she whispered, "You make me feel like myself." At first, I didn't grasp the full meaning of it. But later, I understood that it was the greatest compliment anyone could ever receive. The world often forces people to wear masks, to play roles, to hide parts of themselves in order to be accepted. For her to feel completely herself around me meant she felt no need to pretend, no need to perform. It meant that she trusted me enough to be raw, flawed, imperfect, and real, and that was the purest sign of all. Looking back, I realized that her heart had been speaking all along, but I had only just begun to listen. Every phrase she said, every small slip of honesty, had been a doorway into her feelings. She had not confessed directly, perhaps because fear or caution held her back, but her heart could not help but reveal the truth. And the truth was simple. She wanted me not in a shallow or fleeting way, but in the deep and enduring way that makes a connection unforgettable. The final realization was not in her words alone, but in how those words had changed me. I began to notice her differently, to treasure the quiet moments, to feel the depth of what we shared. It was no longer about searching for signs or analyzing hints. It became about understanding that love, when it comes softly and unexpectedly, often begins in whispers, in accidental phrases, in truths spoken without planning. And when you finally listen, when you truly hear what her heart is saying, you realize that the most powerful confessions are not shouted but spoken quietly, almost unintentionally, in the language of the heart. The end.